Yes, this is Shubhajay sir, and you're watching your as well as my channel. So, until now, I've been getting a few requests of doing this video on the portrait of a lady by Khushwant Singh. So, here I am, but before we begin, let me tell you if you have not subscribed to my channel up till now, please do because I'm pretty sure you're going to find a good lot of material that would help you for your studies over here. So, The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Now, Khushwant Singh was an Indian author, lawyer, diplomat, journalist, and a politician. Okay. And he is most well known for his write ups in the Telegraph newspaper. Okay. I remember it was not very long ago, he was associated with the Telegraph, and he used to write beautiful columns on the different observations of life. Okay, so and that somehow has made me, as a reader, fall in love with his works because he would, in his writings, you would find very details about minute things which we consider as trivial things of life. But he would have a different kind of an eye and perception for all these different things, and that made it. And he would weave out stories out of those mundane and trivial things in such a way that you could not help but fall in love with his writings. In fact, his most well-known novel, The Train to Pakistan, which he had written in 1956, became so popular that it was soon made into a book in 1998. But unfortunately, we lost him in the year 2014. But nevertheless, he still holds an important position in the history of Indian literature in English. Okay. So, without further ado, let's get started. But as I said, if you have not subscribed to my channel, please do. So, here we go. The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. So, the narrator, in this case, Khushwant Singh himself, recalls the moment or the time spent with his grandmother. Okay. And the first impression that he put forward in front of his readers is that all he could remember about the grandmother was that she was very, very old and she had wrinkles all over her face, and he had known her for the last 20 years and she hadn't changed a bit. All right. And for him, it was very difficult to believe that she was pretty, she was young at one point of time, and that she even had a husband. Because, so this tells us one very significant fact that this narrator did not meet his grandfather. The grandfather probably had expired long before. All right. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. A mantelpiece is the space that is there above the fireplace in the house. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. So the grandfather's image was that he was a very serious kind of a man and he looked very aged. So he did not seem like that he could have a pretty wife, he could have bear children. All he could look was like an old man. So the very thought was very, very shocking to this young Khushwant Singh. As for my grandmother being pretty young and pretty, The thought was almost revolting. So he could never believe that the grandmother was very pretty at one point of time. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So, the grandmother would narrate tales from her younger days to this Khushwant Singh and the other siblings, probably, that how she had spent her childhood days. And when she would tell that she used to play or engage in other forms of activities, these people found it very difficult to believe because for them, this woman had never been young. She had always been the grandmother and she had always been this old. Okay. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. This is the physical description of the grandmother. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. So, because of old age, the skin had shrinkled and there were wrinkles all over her face. No, we were certain she had always been, as we had known her, old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. So she had remained like this old. She had not grown a day older, she had not grown a day younger. She had remained the way she had been. So the, the moot point is Khushwant Singh had seen the grandmother as she was in that day. And Khushwant Singh could never believe that this woman could have ever been younger or that this woman can even grow old. Age seemed to have been static for this grandmother. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. Now, this is a very, very important line, students. Uh, the narrator himself confesses she had never been pretty, but she had always been beautiful. Pretty is something which you associate with, external. Pretty is external, prettiness, the way you look. But beauty is something which comes from within. It emanates from within. If you are pure, if you are innocent, if you have no malice in your heart, then you become beautiful. But then, if you only look pretty from the outside and has a malicious heart, and then you want cannot tolerate the goodness of others, cannot tolerate the happiness of others, then certainly you are not beautiful. Okay. So what excuse me. So what Khushwant Singh says is this lady had been very, very beautiful, both internally as well as externally. She hobbled about the house in spotless white. Hobbled doesn't walk with difficulty because of her old age, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stool, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. So she was a religious woman, so she would always chant a prayer and had her rosary beads on her fingers. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face. Why puckered? Puckered as in it has gone inside. The cheeks have gone deep inside. Because of the old age, probably she has lost it. Also, thus, yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. So notice this particular sentence, she was beautiful, and then he goes on to compare her with the winter landscape in the mountains. He says she was like the winter landscape in the mountains. So the point of comparison being that as the winter landscapes look, the mountains in winter looks absolutely white. Okay, and then there is and there is this beauty that emanates from the mountains during such chilly and wintry days because of snow-clad mountain peaks. The the grandmother also seemed to be as beautiful as that. So this is a figure of speech the narrator has used in the this thing in the comparison, and this is known as a simile. Whenever we use comparison, whenever we use comparison, whenever we compare two things rather with the words like and as, then it is known as a simile. All right. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. So, the parents of Khushwant Singh went to live in the city. So, this tells us that they used to live in the village. Okay. And the grandmother and the grandson had stayed back, and thus began their good old camaraderie. So, good old friendship days. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice, but never bothered to learn. As is the case with all young kids, nobody is really interested in that way in the religious sermons. All they are interested in is what the prasadam would be, what the I mean, who is singing the song, how the God looks like, what the God, all and everything apart from the religious part of it. So was the case with Khushwant Singh. So he hardly cared what the mantras were, what the prayer meant. All he was interested in was the grandmother was singing, and it meant a lot for him because the grandmother's voice he loved. Then she would fetch my wooden sled, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen inkpot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati and a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. So the grandmother was a social worker as well. She used to feed the stray dogs as well. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. So, this is again reiterating the fact that the grandmother had been a religious woman. So, we have got several instances. First, that she always had this rosary beads while she had been walking in the house, and she would always, her lips would move in inaudible monotonous prayers. Okay. Then we have the instance wherein it is said um, that this lady always woke up in the morning and sang the prayers. Okay. And now here we have one more instance wherein it is said that the school was attached to the temple and thus she chose to travel with the narrator. While the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, my grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. Scriptures are holy books. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. So the village dogs by now had known the regular regime, what kind of regime this grandmother would follow, how she would come out of the temple with her grandson and throw chapatis. So they were a very regular this thing there. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. This was that was a turning point in our friendship. So thus begins a new chapter in the life of both the grandmother and the grandson. This part onwards, we have to be very cautious while in reading because this part will show us the transition in the relationship, the change in the equation between the grandmother and the grandson. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the street, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. This is very important because he used to go to an English school. There were no temples attached. Because there were no temples attached, the grandmother felt no necessity, no need to travel with this grandson to the school. So even though they shared the same room, she started secluding herself. A rift starts growing between the grandson and the grandmother. Most importantly, they would not walk anymore. That the long walk they would take from home to school in the village is now no longer there because now the grandson travels in the school bus. As the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time, she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. This made her unhappy. So she was she used to inquire what did they teach in school. And as usual, he used to tell that he was taught English, he was taught science, he was taught mathematics, but these all things could not make her happy. She could not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English schools and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and scriptures. Because she had been a religious woman, her main concern was that everyone should be aware religiously. They should be conscious enough religiously. But now, because this grandson goes to an English school where there are no temples, no scriptures being taught, she was very, very unhappy, distressed, as it is mentioned. One day, I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed. To her, music had lewd associations, lewd, bad. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars and not meant for gentlefolk. So the grandmother was of the opinion music only belongs to people who are not from the cream, who do not belong to the cream of the society, to the harlots and beggars. Harlots are people of lower social rank and beggars, of course, and not for the gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. She rarely talked to me up to that. So, slowly, step by step, the distance starts growing between the grandson and the grandmother. When I went to the university, I was given a room of my own. Now the distance grows even more, even wider. Previously, they used to share the same room, even though they would talk less or see less of each other. But now, though, the room is also separated. So, bedroom children, you should, because now you are senior secondary students, you should be able to understand this that bedrooms are very, very personal spaces. When you are sharing a bedroom with someone, that means you share that kind of happiness, that kind of confidence, that kind of love and affection with that person. It could be your parents, it could be your grandparents, it could be your brother and sister. I mean, you're comfortable sharing your personal and private space with them. So here also, this young boy was very much comfortable in sharing that private space. But now that he has grown up, his needs have changed. His ideas about life has changed. Everything around him has changed. And thus he moves to a separate bedroom where he can no longer share his private space. So the distance widens to a greater extent. The common link of friendship was snapped. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. So she did not say anything as such that why are you going away and all that, but she became silent and she accepted this because she has also got to realize that somehow her importance in the life of the grandson has started to dwindle, has started to grow less. She rarely left his spinning wheel to talk to anyone because she was extremely moved by all this. you know, all these happenings all around. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel spinning and reciting prayers. Only in the afternoon she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. While she sat in the veranda breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirrupings. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders, some even sat on her head. She smiled but never shooed them away. It used to be the happiest half an hour of the day for her. So now that she has accepted her resignation, accepted her seclusion from her own family, immediate family, she had devoted herself to the sparrows. The sparrows now come, they keep creating noise, they keep chirping, they keep moving around, they keep flying around, hovering around her. But then also she doesn't get disturbed. Not for a moment does she shoo them away because they have become her companion now. When I decided to go abroad for further studies, I was sure my grandmother would be upset. I would be away for 5 years, and at her age, no one could never tell. So the narrator thought because he's going away abroad, the grandmother would be very, very sad. But then, unfortunately, the grandmother wasn't. Why? This is because maybe now physically the grandson is going away so far, but emotionally and psychologically he had been away from the grandmother right from the day they have come to the city. So the grandmother has started accepting that from that very day. So by now she has become accustomed to all this. So she doesn't feel sad. But my grandmother, she was not even sentimental. This is the reason she was not even sentimental. She came to leave me at the railway station, but did not talk or show any emotion because she had known this since the first day of her arrival in the city. Her lips moved in prayer. Her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of her rosary. Silently, she kissed my forehead, and when I left, I cherished the most moist imprint as perhaps the last sign of physical contact between us. The grandson thought, the narrator thought, that it would be the last sign of physical contact before going away because he wasn't sure that after returning from abroad whether he would be able to meet the grandmother or not. Why is that? Because remember from the very first sentence of the story, what is said? She had been very, very old, so the grandson can never imagine that she would live forever. Okay, so therefore he's already in a dilemma whether he would, whenever he comes back, even after 5 years, whether he would be able to meet the grandmother or not. But that was not so. After 5 years, I came back home and was met by her at the station. She did not look a day older. She still had no time for words. See, she did not look a day older. So again, going back to the very first sentence of the story, my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for 20 years that I had known her. So she had not grown any day older. Again, which is being told here. She still had no time for words, and while she clasped me in her arms, that is, embraced me, I could hear her reciting her prayers. Even on the first day of my arrival, her happiest moments were with her sparrows, whom she fed longer and with frivolous rebukes, like scolding them once or twice, the sparrows, for creating too much of noise, probably, but never shooing them away, of course. Now, this is something, even on the first day of my arrival, her happiest moments were with her sparrows. Why? She was not overjoyed or overwhelmed by the arrival of the grandson. This is precisely, again, the same reason that her grandson had gone away physically and emotionally from her long back. So whether he comes back now physically is immaterial because psychologically he had been away long, long back. In the evening, a change came over her. She did not pray. She collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, and started to sing. For several hours, she thumped the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum. Dilapidated is old, and sang of the homecoming of the warriors. We had to persuade her to stop to avoid overstraining. That was the first time since I had known her that she did not pray. So that evening she broke from the regular routine. She broke her regular routine. The next morning she was taken ill. It was a mild fever, and the doctor told us that. But my grandmother thought differently. She told her that her end was near, so she already had the premonition of her death. She told us that her end was near. She said that since only a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life, she had omitted to pray, she was not going to any more time talking to us. So even on her deathbed, she refused to talk to the family who had like secluded her totally. In Bengali, there is this term called, it was not anger, it was not sadness, it was not um, unhappiness. In Bengali, we have a term for this. We call it obhiman. Okay. Loose translation in English would mean wounded pride. Okay. But I'm not very sure whether that translation is appropriate or not. But the thing is that she had this obhiman that her family had gone away, her family on whom she had depended on her life, if not only financially, psychologically, emotionally. They had gone away so far from her. Okay. Even the grandson on whom she had so much of love, care, and dependence, even he had gone away psychologically from her. So that is why she was a little hurt. So coming back, we protested, but she ignored our protest. She lay peacefully in bed, praying and telling her beads. Even before we could suspect, her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her face, and we knew that she was dead. So, while saying her prayers only, she passes away. We lifted her off the bed and, as is customary, laid her on the ground and covered her with a red shroud. Shroud is a cloth. After a few hours of mourning, we left her alone to make arrangements for her funeral. Again, very, very important sentence. We left her alone to make arrangements. So even when she is long dead and gone, she is again kept away. So this woman, in the in the last phase of her life, had remained alone, lonely. And loneliness, I tell you, is a terrible, terrible thing, children. In the evening, we went to her room. Especially, loneliness is a terrible thing no matter whichever age bracket or age group you're in. But then, if you're old, it is very, very dangerous. It eats you up, you know. Anyway, coming back, yes. In the evening, we went to her room and a crude stretcher to take her to be cremated. The sun was setting and had lit her room and veranda with a blaze of golden light. We stopped half away in the courtyard, all over the veranda and in her room, right up to where she lay dead and stiff, wrapped in the red shroud. Thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. So, as if the sparrows have come to express their grief, express their sadness, to express their condolences. There was no chirruping. So all this while, every day while the sparrows would come, they would create so much of noise that at one point of time the grandmother would have to like scold them. But today, even they have realized their loss. And Thus, they do not make any more noise. They keep quiet. We felt sorry for the birds, and my mother fed some bread for them. She broke it into little crumbs the way my grandmother used to and threw it to them. The sparrows took no notice of the bread. They did not come here today to eat. They have come here to express their sadness over the loss of the grandmother. When we carried when we carried my grandmother's corpse off, corpse is a dead body, they flew away quietly. Next morning, the sweeper swept the breadcrumbs into the dustbin. So, at the end, we see even the sparrows, the animals, the birds also were expressing their sadness. Okay. So that completes the story. It's apparently a very simple story, but then it has layers of meanings attached to it. I'm pretty sure that while discussing the story, you have got the hint of some of the major themes of the story, that is, of loneliness, number one. And then you have this character analysis, which previously you would require to do, of the grandmother. But now that we do not have any questions as such, writing questions, answers that needs to be written from this chapter, because this is kept for your first semester of your CBSE class 11 syllabus, wherein you would be only getting MCQs on this. So I do not think that we need to do that in elaborate details. Nevertheless, I have already dropped hints that she was extremely religious woman, and then she was suffering from this loneliness in a crowd. Even though she was with her family, she was far removed from her family psychologically, and no one really understood that. So, well, that's the story. If you have liked it, please press the like button, give a thumbs up, and please, before leaving, do not forget, once again, I'm reminding you to subscribe to my channel. Thank you. See you again with the next video.